we won't be recording the breakout sessions, just so you know. So I'll just start my screen share. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. Oh, there we go. Scroll back. How's that? Can everyone see that? Yes, fantastic. Okay, excellent. So, sorry, I've got two screens up, so if it looks like I'm looking between them, that's why. So yeah, welcome everyone. So my name's Anais, and I coordinate the Replenish project. So we work county-wide, and we support people to reduce their food waste, compost at home, and grow their own food. And we're funded by the County Council. I'm going to be delivering the session today with Emily from Harvest at Home. Emily, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself?
I'm Emily. I'm from Harvest at Home. It's a group that started for COVID to help people grow their own food. We try to provide food security for the ground up for people who access food banks and food larders especially, but now we've kind of grown to anybody who wants to grow their own food. We're funded mostly by Cherwell District Council.
Thank you, Emily. Great, and we're putting on the session tonight with the help of Oxford Brookes. So I think possibly quite a few of you might be associated with Brookes, either students or staff. So yeah, welcome. And so overview of the session. So yeah, growing your own on a budget. So if growing at home is a really fantastic way to be able to eat fresh produce all year round, and if you're looking to live more sustainably, then it's a really great way to do that, but it can end up costing quite a lot of money easily. So we'll look at a few different ways that you can do it, even if without breaking the bank, basically. So we'll look at some reuse and upcycling ideas. We'll look at how you can make your own compost from kitchen and garden waste, which is sort of both a really good way to sort of deal with your waste in an environmentally friendly way, and as well as create some free fertilizer from waste. And then we'll have some breakout discussions so that you can share all of your ideas, because I'm sure that you've got plenty as well. And lastly, we'll have a Q&A at the end. We'll wrap up at 7 o'clock. So I'll pass over to Emily, who can talk a little bit more about getting growing. And again, if you've got anything that comes up, just pop it in the chat and we can address it.
Right, so first off, can everyone just sort of let me know in the chat if you've never grown your own food before? Is there anyone here who's never grown any type of food before? All right, fantastic. So is 80% of the users who use Harvest at Home. So don't worry, but we will start right from the beginning then. Growing your own food is basically like growing anything else. It can be quite simple. Don't buy into the myth that you have to do it a certain way. There are many ways to grow your own food. You can actually do it quite cheaply. And Anais will speak a little bit about composting later, which is the biggest cost in my experience really associated with growing your own food. So I would definitely recommend taking her tips on board today. So what we're going to start out with a little bit is the differences in how you start off growing your own food and with seeds. So you can do one type of growing, which is called direct sowing into the ground where you want the plant to grow, or you can also indirect sow in small pots, in blue rolls, in punnets, and basically lots of other containers that we'll discuss later. In all cases, I would say, so first of all, what you see here on the screen, we'll share it with you later with links so you can kind of peruse it. But the first considerations really with anything are whether you want to grow outside directly, have something for some plants that could come inside for different sun conditions, and when you want to plant your vegetables is actually quite important. So right now is a really good planting time for a lot of seeds. And then a bit later, you can plant seeds to stay. For example, squash, you can plant it now. Celeriac, you can plant kind of almost year round. Cabbages, you can plant almost kind of year round. RHS has great resources, a whole calendar you can download about when to plant your vegetables. Sow seeds just every few centimeters. Again, you'll have guides online for specific plants. And if you have a very small planting space, like for example, at Harvest at Home, we actually have you plant in a box about this size, which is around 2 feet squared. And then you can plant specific plants together. It's called companion planting to make the most out of your small space. and you can grid it out to make sure you stay within your squares. So the other things to really consider when you plant seeds, you want to make sure your ground is moist, the soil is moist. You want to have a soil that's kind of fine and not too clumpy so that your roots can have good spread. And you want to make sure you don't water it too much. I've seen more plants die from being overwatered than underwatered. You want to make sure you use large containers if you're planting a large seed. So these beans, you want to have a fairly large container with a good 6 centimeters or more of depth for a large root. They say, I think it's about 2 to 3 times the size that you expect it to be. And then for small seeds, you can actually plant them quite close together and spread them out later if you like. So some of the small seeds are things like broccoli, cabbage, carrots, although people will give you mixed reviews on carrots, whether you should plant them in the dirt, direct sow. But for some of the other small seeds, you can just thin them later and save space in your greenhouse or cold frame. Speaking of greenhouses or cold frames, if you plant your seedlings indoors, you're going to want to harden them off in kind of like a mid zone before you plant them outside. And this is to get them adjusted to the elements, wind, sun, rain, and the differences in temperature you get outside relative to a temperature controlled place like in your house. So you can do that by hardening them off. That's a term you'll read about. And you just move the seedlings outside during the day, back inside during night, or put them under a cover when they're outside at night so that they are protected from the elements for just a couple of weeks until they're ready to be planted out. As I said earlier, if you can plant your seeds into a large container to move in and outdoors. In this climate, tomatoes, aubergines, peppers, melons, cucumbers, and some of them really will do better if they're inside because they don't like it to be under 4 degrees. So are there any questions just basically about seed handling? I would say read a few things if you can, some of the links that we share with you today, and try a few methods and see what works best for you and your timeline and your particular windowsill situation if you're planning inside your house. So are there any questions before we go to the next slide? Okay, can we move on?
I just ask a quick question, very quick question. Planting seeds, often you want to plant last year's seeds or the year before. Do seeds have a shelf life, or can you just use them the following year and the year after? What would you recommend?
Seeds do have a shelf life.
Okay.
So not all seeds do, and if they're kept in the right conditions, they can actually last a long time. But places that can save seeds for, say, decades have special equipment to do so. So really most of your seeds, if they've been around, I've had success with stuff that's up to 5 or 10 years old, but you can always test a batch of the seeds to see if they're too old. And how you do that is by spacing the seeds out on a wet cloth, like a paper towel, and kind of making a little paper towel bed for your seeds. And then if they germinate, let's say plant 10 seeds, whatever percentage germinates is your chance of getting plants out of that batch. So you may, if you have seeds around, I would say go ahead and try to germinate them.
Yeah.
But sometimes, yes, there's a seed life. And definitely when a corporation sells you a pack of seeds, there's a life there, but it might not necessarily be the date of germination.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So is May a good time to start planting seeds for food? So there are a lot of things, yes, you can plant in May, and a lot of things you can start planting out in May. So things like carrots, you can start just sowing it directly in the ground, lettuce, cabbages, broccoli, beetroot, all of those things you can basically from the end of April past the last frost all the way through, you can plant those seeds for food. You should be very careful about planting some things too late because you won't give time for the plant to develop and give you fruit. So I do suggest starting some things like tomatoes, squash, and melons inside in April or March if you can, or have some set up outside to keep them very warm at night if you're keeping them outside, or else the plants won't be able to really ripen the fruit on the bush. If you go to the RHS website, they have great calendars that you can download. And we actually are working on one at Harvest at Home as well, where you can just download our outreach calendar, and then it will tell you exactly what time of year to do what things in the garden. So you can just kind of pull it up in the phone and be like, oh, this week I need to plant the following types of seeds. So we're working on that, but there are other resources there that can help time specific seeds for this climate. You might notice from my accent, I'm not from this climate. So I actually learned that the hard way, because this is the time of year we would be harvesting things like strawberries and tomatoes. But of course here you're just, kind of planting them and getting them going. So how much watering is too much watering? Ooh, that's a really good question. So I would say try to let your seedlings dry out. I water my seedlings every 3 days or so when they're in the direct heat, hot heat. You can let them dry out, but don't let them get like crispy. So I would say every 3 days or so. You don't want to water them, every day unless you're only giving them a little bit of water, but it's kind of better to soak them and then leave them for that water to go and then soak them again. If you have a little bit of moisture every day, that can develop mold and stuff that is not ideal. Some people do it differently. Some people actually mist their seedlings every day with a water bottle and stuff. So I would say try to use a method that works for you and doesn't kill the plants, but you will kill them by giving them too much water for sure, because the plants can't soak in any nutrients if there's too much water. Do you recommend soaking seeds before planting? Some seeds.
Sorry, Emily.
Yeah.
Sorry, Emily. And just to add to that, apparently if you water the seedlings a little bit less often, but sort of give them a good soaking, that encourages them to develop roots. Whereas if you give them like really regular shallow watering, they'll get kind of more shallow roots. So that's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because the same thing works for nutrients. So a lot of people just put manure on top of the bed, but actually if you put it underneath your seedlings, then the roots will grow towards nutrients because they'll seek it out. If you have a lot here, then you can have kind of a top heavy plant as well with the water. So soaking seeds before planting. Some species, I don't ever really soak my seeds before planting except for certain types of flowers in the delphinium sort of family. Some people recommend that you always do it. If you use a nice moist compost, you don't necessarily need to, but you can germinate them first and grow them as well. So again, I think that's the sort of stuff that I haven't noticed any more success if I soaked mine. There are some types of plants that do require it. So okra, for example, you'll get a better crop if you soak it because of the type of seed it is. But I think people don't really grow that here very much. And otherwise the delphinia is really, I don't know. What about you, Anna? Do you soak your seeds before? That's a good question. It's like an icebreaker. Do you soak your seeds before planting?
I don't tend to, actually. I'll make sure that the potting soil is really good and moist, and I'll make sure to keep watering them enough, and just when they're kind of getting going, so that they're not drying out.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I don't tend to. No. Okay.
Is that all the questions?
I think it is. Yes.
Great.
There'll be time for more later if other things come up. Great. Okay.
So I touched on this a little bit before. It's important to space your plants when you start planting your seedlings out, and that should be after you've hardened them off, and definitely not when it's still below sort of like 40 at night, unless you're protecting 40 or 4 degrees at night, unless you're protecting them just to be safe, because seedlings can be a little bit delicate. But some plants like broccoli and cabbage and squash and melons need a lot of space. So when you are planting your garden, think about like the size of the fruit and think about what size of plant needs to occur to have that sort of thing you harvest from it as a general rule. So a carrot really only needs about 8 to 12 inches into the ground directly around it, and a few centimeters on either side. A broccoli, which forms a flower that size, actually needs quite a big space. I said 4 degrees Celsius, which is about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So I am still stuck on Fahrenheit, even though I've been living here 10 years. But so yeah, it's 4 degrees Celsius though, because that's kind of the magic number for some of those plants that like a little bit warmer climates. So yeah, tomatoes are also ones that need a lot of space, but you can do something called companion planting quite easily with tomatoes. So you can decrease the amount of space they need by planting plants around them that will kind of protect them and not compete for nutrients. Again, when you select your veg, you should really be thinking about if you have limited space, thinking about what plants will go really well together and create an environment where they actually help one another. Tomatoes and basil are really good, and they don't just taste good together. They're really good companion plants because basil are kind of pest preventers for tomatoes. And actually, I would recommend making a giant like perimeter of herbs around tomatoes if you really want to, if you have a pest problem, because most of the herbs will keep a lot of the pests away from your plants. So just scatter them throughout your garden. Beans and beets are also quite good for one another. So beets don't require very much nitrogen at all because you want the root to form. And beans are nitrogen fixing and actually, kind of replenish the nitrogen that they sort of take, and they do really, really well together. So in a square foot, I usually plant 1 bean plant and like 9 beets around it. And then I have a really lovely crop from that. If you have a place to leave things like runner beans in the ground, they will volunteer. I'm not sure if that's the term that's used here, but we call it volunteer, which means next year they'll come up again. So just leave them there. They'll form some tubers for you and they'll come up, and you don't really have to plant them anymore. Strawberries and spinach also go well together, and garlic and strawberries go really well together. And again, garlic, chives, anything from the alum family you can use to create a perimeter to keep pests away from the garden in general. You can kind of build like a natural fence because the pests find the smell really unappealing, so they won't cross through, say, a patch of chives to get to your other stuff. Let's see what else. So when you actually plant your seedlings, it is pretty simple. Make sure that the soil is moist. Dig a small hole, just enough space for your seedling. Put the seedling in, and then fill the soil around the hole. For tomatoes, you want to build a little bit of soil above because they'll form new roots if you do that from the stems. But try not to cover the lowest leaves on most of your plants, and definitely water them. And then I water mine about once a week when they're after the first few weeks that I've planted them. But you should check them every few days just in case, and never water them in the heat of the day. You should definitely just water them in the cool of the morning or the cool of the evening. Some of your tomatoes may kind of wilt like this and ask you for water when it's really hot in the day, but that's actually a natural defense mechanism. So don't water them when they're all wilty and sad in the middle of the afternoon. Water them a bit later. Anna, no, so self-seeding is when something, well, actually, maybe I might get this wrong, actually, I'm not sure. So self-seeding, as I understand it, is when something is kind of like self-pollinating. And we'll see it again. Volunteering is when the plant actually comes again because it's a perennial plant that gets dormant during the dormant season. But I might be wrong about the self-seeding now that I think about it, because that's self-pollinating, right?
Yeah, no, self-seeding, I think just for me is just something that would flower and then the seeds would drop and then it would...
Oh, right, the flowering and the seeds drop.
Yeah,
so this is the same plant, and it goes dormant and forms a tuber in the same way that garlic or something would. It forms another unit that you could transplant if you want to. Or dahlias. Are people familiar with dahlias? So a bean looks like a dahlia if you pull it up. It has all these giant tubers that come out, or an iris or something. So presumably you could actually split those and plant them again for next year. But we just call it volunteering when the actual plants come back. So I'm not sure if it's, I'm gonna have to Google that because I'm not sure if it's all encompassing. Right, and then also make sure that you water your plants at least once a week. Feed your plants at least every couple of weeks. Are you gonna talk a little bit about making fertilizer? Well, we're gonna talk about making fertilizer later, right?
Yeah, well, I'll touch on it briefly. Yeah. Great. Okay.
Cool. And then we have some links later where you can learn about sort of gardening and maintaining your garden. A lot of people pinch off their tomato plants and prune things down. Honestly, once I plant it, I just let it be. I, sacrifice tomatoes to the birds every year. I think there are often a lot of questions about that. Well, should I prune this? Should I break these off? I would say the biggest tip that's going to prevent sadness is you definitely want to make sure you have something to hold a melon or a squash or a very heavy fruit if you have trained a vine up a trellis, because otherwise the fruit will become too much for the stems of the plant. But I don't have that problem because I just pick a place and let my squash plants grow as big as they want to grow out onto the pavement and stuff. So yeah. Are there any questions about generally planting or sort of early growing your veg?
I have a question. What is the best time to plant your seeds? Is early morning or should it be late evening?
I usually plant my seedlings in the morning because then they'll get the full sun on the first day. Because I've already hardened them off for the sun, but I want them to get all that warmth and retain it for the evening. I'm not sure if I've ever looked it up to see if that's the best way to do it or not though. So that's what I do, but yeah, or it might just be because that's when my children will want to plant the seedlings with me. And if I do it at the end of the day, it'll interfere with dinner time. I'm not sure actually.
Thank you.
All right, well, maybe we'll move on for now, and if anything else comes up, we can touch on that later. Great, thanks so much, Emily. All right, so just moving on. Okay, great. So we'll look a little bit at some ideas for upcycling and reusing. So firstly, container planting. So planting in containers is a really, really good option. You know, sorry, I keep doing that. A really good option if you're limited on space. And there's plenty of things that you can use as containers. I mean, generally, like anything that you can put some holes in at the bottom can work. So here I've just put a list of a few things that you could use. So there's some 5-gallon buckets, even a bag of potting soil with some holes poked in the bottom. You know, for anyone who's got those tomato grow bags, you'll have seen that before. Some things you want to avoid just because they might have some kind of chemicals or things that'll be a little bit toxic potentially. So just, sorry, I'm trying to admit people from the waiting room. There we go. So I would, avoid buckets that have contained, you know, chemicals or cat litter, laundry soap, that sort of thing. See-through containers as well, because you want to just make sure that it's not getting any light through onto the roots. And for the same reason, treated wood and painted wood I would avoid. I'll touch on, at the end, I'll just touch on using pallets and other kinds of wood that have been treated, and some are okay to use and some you want to avoid. So I'll touch on that later on which ones are kind of safer to use. And just a brief thing to mention is that if you have, you know, any kind of equipment like, you know, tools, other garden equipment that's maybe broken or needs repairing, then we've got a really amazing network of repair cafes in Oxfordshire that you can go along to. You can go to these community events. You can take whatever it is that you've got that's broken, and there'll be volunteers that can help you fix it for free. So there's about 13 groups that run them at the moment in Oxfordshire. So if you want to sort of see where your local one is, then you can just have a look at that website at the bottom. I'll send the slides through at the end of the session for anyone who wants to find out more about those. I'll just check the chat. Yes, that is amazing, Myra. I agree. Great. Okay. And I'll just pass back to Emily, who's got a few more ideas for upcycling.
Right, so when you're using stuff to grow food, some of the added costs are things like watering cans, tools, water catchment, which can be very important, especially in drought season. So there are ways that you can repurpose things like milk bottles, especially plastic, and eventually it will disintegrate, at which point you could recycle it, but you can at least get some other use out of it. So that's just what we've mentioned here. In the bottom of the slide, you'll see a little milk carton where there's actually a line drawn around, and if you cut that out, you can form a shovel that's perfectly good for anything you'll use with any kind of fine compost, seedlings and such. It works quite well. That's a fun activity to do with families as well. And then if you just poke some holes with a skewer in the top of any kind of water bottle, you can use it as a watering can, and that's very good as well for your seedlings, because it won't, especially when they're quite young, because it won't be so much pressure that it just misplaces all your hard work of carefully putting a hole in the ground and putting a seed in it. And then when you're hardening some of your vegetables off and your seedlings off, what you can do is just cover them with little individual greenhouses like plastic cups, glass jars, plastic bags, anything like that, just to kind of protect them from the frost is a perfect way to harden your plants out, and also, of course, reuse an item instead of just trashing it in the first place.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Excellent. All right, we're just about on time. That's always a bonus. So we're just going to move into some breakout rooms just for 5 minutes, and just so that you can share some of your ideas. So I've got 2 questions here. So what other ideas do you have for upcycling, reuse and accessing affordable materials? And just thinking about your own situation, is there anything else that you need currently? And just maybe you could discuss where you might find that. Maybe other people in your group might have some ideas for you. So I'll put those 2 questions in the chat and just put you into rooms briefly now. So here we go.
Anna also uses that and reuses punnets in a really good way for her seedlings. So thanks,
Okay.
Michelle.
Perfect. I'm so glad you're using them. They're being reused, which is fantastic. Thanks, Emily.
Brilliant.
Oh,
Great.
Jennifer, you're from Texas. We don't call them that. That you get your fruit and veg in the grocery store. Like if you get blueberries or something, yeah.
Great. Someone got some raised beds on free cycle or Freegal that were from old IKEA drawers. Great. I wonder if they were mine actually, maybe. Great. And excellent. Tetra packs as well can be quite good. Perfect. All right. So we'll move on now. So I'll just start sharing my screen again and just talk a little bit about home composting. Excellent. Can everyone see that? Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So yeah, composting. There we go. So yeah, it's a really great way to be recycling your kitchen waste and your garden waste, and you can use it on your garden. It's an excellent way of sort of adding nutrients into the soil and adding beneficial microorganisms as well. So just briefly, I mean, I think probably you're all familiar with it as you're all growing already, but for anyone who doesn't know, compost essentially is taking organic matter, so it's food waste, garden waste, wood chip, anything that was alive basically, and it gets broken down by sort of microorganisms, so that's your bacteria, your fungi, your nematodes, etc., that are kind of already present there and in your soil, and over a process of, depending on the method you use, it might be it might be a few weeks, it might be up to a year. It'll get broken down into this sort of really rich, this rich product called compost. So I just touched on some of the benefits of compost, but yeah, aside from adding nutrients into the soil, it's also a really environmentally friendly way to deal with food waste, and it can also help build soil structure as well. So there's a few different ways of composting at home. So I think probably the most common way for sort of composting household food waste and garden waste is cold composting. So you can see sort of a plastic bin there, which some of you might have already. So this one, you can kind of add waste gradually to the bin or to the heap, whatever you're using. This is probably the kind of lowest effort way of doing it. You need to turn the compost with a garden fork or an aerator every few weeks. But that's basically all you need to do. An aerator is, basically it's like a sort of metal stick that's a bit spiraled, and you can use that in these bins. That's quite handy because getting a garden fork in there is just quite tricky. So I'll send a bit more information about that after the session if you're interested. This is quite a slow process, so it'll probably take 6 to 12 months depending on how often you're turning it and various other factors. One of the downsides about this is that you wouldn't want to be composting cooked food, meat, fish or dairy, because firstly cooked food can draw vermin, and also it can also, like, you might have pathogens that are in those foods which wouldn't potentially break down because the compost isn't getting hot enough to get rid of those. For the same reason, I would be careful about putting any perennial weeds in there, because they can they'll just keep coming back, and you put them back on your soil and then they'll grow again. And again, plants that have got diseases or infested with pests I would avoid as well. I mean, maybe in small quantities, but I certainly wouldn't be putting a lot of those in there. So yeah, you can use a Dalek bin. If you live in Oxfordshire, you can get them for £18.50. I've put a link in there. And you can also make your own bin. So you could use pallets or chicken wire, or even just have an open heap if you don't mind it looking a little bit messier. And those can be quite handy if you want a bit more space. I mean, the thing with these bins is that they are quite small. So depending on how much waste you're producing, that might not be enough for you. Can be quite good to have. If you have a sort of pallet bin, you can have 3 bays. So you can be putting the waste in one bay and then turning it, and then after a certain amount of time you can move it into the next bay, and then you can be adding new waste to the first bay, and then it means that you're not kind of adding like fresh waste to compost that's already nearly finished. So that's quite a good option if you've got the space for it. Questions? Great. Okay, we'll come on to that in a minute. Thank you. And hot composting. This is sort of similar to the cold composting. So you can be composting your garden waste and your kitchen waste as well. The main difference here is that it's quite a bit faster. So it's sort of 3 weeks to 3 months, depending on the method you're using. Instead of adding all of your waste kind of gradually, normally you need to kind of put it all in at once and then be turning it regularly. The reason it gets hot is because there's a sort of much faster growth of the bacteria that are breaking down your waste, and this produces a heat. And this heat is beneficial because it'll kill off pathogens, pests, weed seeds. So that does mean that you can, if you're using this method, you can be composting some of the stuff like your cooked food, your meat, your fish, your dairy, that you wouldn't be putting if it was in a cold compost bin. As someone sort of mentioned earlier, it can be a bit of a challenge. You do need to be a bit more, you're a little bit more rigorous about when you're doing it, how you're doing it, what you're adding, etc., because you have to be controlling the temperature quite well. So if you're looking for something quite easy, this might not be the best option for you. And you can do it in a hot bin. So here's my hot bin there, or you can have a heap as well. Okay, so another method is a wormery, also known as vermicomposting or worm farms. So this is just for composting your kitchen waste. This is quite a nice method if you don't have any outdoor space or if you've got limited space. So it produces some really good quality products from it. So just firstly, you can see here, this is just a little picture. So you've got the worms in there, you put your food waste on top, and then the worms are kind of moving upwards. They're eating the food waste, and then as they move upwards, they leave behind their worm casts, which add a lot of nutrients into the compost. And it also produces a sort of worm tea, we call it, which comes out of the tap at the bottom, and you can be using that as a fertilizer. Another benefit of this method is you don't need to turn it because the worms do that job for you. It can be a little bit pricey to buy these. I think they can be sort of upwards of £100, but they're also quite easy to make yourself. We've got a guide of how to make a wormery on our website, so you can follow that link and have a look. And I think Emily might talk about this later, but they are producing some DIY wormery kits, which people might be able to get hold of as well. Just one thing to watch out for is that if you're using this method, you want to be careful about composting citrus and alliums like onions, because worms really don't like these. And so if you put in large quantities, it's possible to actually just kill off all of your worms. And lastly, another method, if you're just looking to compost food waste, is bokashi. So this is a little bit different from the other methods that we've talked about. So it's an anaerobic process that uses a bran that's been inoculated with microorganisms, So you put your food waste into like a bin, and you add this bokashi bran, and it basically ferments your food waste. Again, it's quite a good option if you've only got indoor space, because it's quite small. You can just have it on a tabletop, and you can be putting any kind of kitchen waste in there. It produces this really nice concentrated fertilizer that again comes out of a tap at the bottom, and you can dilute that with water and use that on your garden. The one thing is that although this can be done indoors, the sort of the waste that's produced, it's not fully decomposed in the same way that it does with other methods of composting. So you have to then find something to do with that. So normally people bury it in their gardens. So you need to find somewhere that you could bury it, possibly if you don't have space, maybe you have neighbours or friends who wouldn't mind letting you do that, but probably will need some space for that. You can add that waste to a wormery afterwards if you want to have sort of two systems going side by side. And just the only thing to be aware of is to do that gradually, because it takes them a bit of time to get used to this fermented food. All right, so if any questions, what should you line a pallet bin with? Okay, I'll touch on that at the end if that's okay. I mean, you don't necessarily have to line a pallet. If it's a compost bin, I probably wouldn't line it unless I'm using something that's been treated. And in the slides that I'll share at the end, I'll have a list of the things treated woods that you want to avoid. And if you are going to use any of those, I would line it with polythene. But unless if it's not treated wood, I wouldn't bother lining it. Obviously, at some point it will start to rot, but that's okay. I mean, you can normally get pallets for free or for cheap anyway, so it's the sort of thing that will last you a few years, and then you might have to make another one. And no, bokashi doesn't smell. You can keep the lid on. In fact, actually, you're supposed to really. It shouldn't be getting any air in there if you can. So you actually want to be squishing down the food waste to avoid that. In terms of there's a question about which is the best place to put a compost bin in an east-facing garden. I don't know what you would say to this, Emily. I mean, you want compost to be getting some of the sun and the heat of the day, because that will help speed up the process. You don't want it to get too hot as well. So I mean, I think if it's an east-facing garden, I think that wouldn't be too much of a problem. But yeah, if you wouldn't want it against a north-facing wall, personally, I would avoid that. Can you put it in your compost? Can you put bokashi in your compost bin as opposed to burying it? I think the reason that people bury it is because it's not fully broken down. So some of those, some of the pathogens, etc., like you can't be sure that they're gone. So if you're putting it in a cold compost bin, it's not certain that they'll be kind of gone by the time you finish that composting process. So it probably is better to bury it if you can. Emily, did you want to add anything to that?
No, not really. I don't really have that much of a preference about the compost bin either. I was trying to think about that. I have ours in sort of the southeast corner of the garden. Seems to work all right.
Okay.
A little bit of afternoon shade.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so just, I won't go through this now, but if you want to have a look at the slides after, I've just kind of made a little table that sort of talks about some of the composting systems and how you might decide what's best for you. I mean, just to say that there's quite a few different systems, and I haven't talked about everything, but these are some of the main ones. Okay, so questions. I'll just leave a few minutes. If people have got questions, feel free to unmute yourself or pop it in the chat. I'll stop my screen share now so that you can see everyone. Have I all overwhelmed you with composting information?
Why don't you use tyres? Why did you not recommend tyres?
I think it's because I think it's because it can leach something into the soil. So I've heard it's best not to use them. Emily, would you use tires?
I do use tires to grow my potatoes, but I didn't want to say anything because I didn't ever look it up because it's just something that we do. So I don't know.
Okay.
But yeah, I do, because they're very easy to stack on top of one another and keep adding soil. So you can actually grow your potatoes quite high that way, and it keeps them warm. I also grow corn in the tires with the potatoes. So I might look it up now. I don't know. I will Google it now.
Another question, what benefit does coffee grounds add to soil? Coffee is really high in nitrogen, and that's one of the sort of key nutrients that you want in your soil. So yeah, it's really good. I think I've heard you might want to be careful about adding it in really large quantities because it can make the soil, I think, more acidic, or it does something to the pH. But if it's just household, you know, the amount you're using in your house, I think it's probably fine.
I actually use coffee because of its acidity in specific instances in the garden. So for example, if you really want strawberries to produce fruit, they need acidic soil. So you can add some coffee grounds to that, or you can also add them for your blueberries. Your mint does quite well in acidic soil. So just be careful, but they can be helpful in that way because it's a natural fertilizer if it changes the pH.
Great. Yeah, blueberries are another thing that like acidic soil as well. Thank you to those who are sharing some useful links in there. How do you know when your compost is ready? Good question. I mean, I normally just sort of look at mine, and if it looks like it's broken down, then I'll assume it's ready. But if you want a slightly more scientific test, if you have got a thermometer, a sort of a soil thermometer, then normally when you turn your compost, the increase in sort of bacterial activity will cause it to heat up again as it's starting to break things down. So if you turn the compost and then it doesn't increase in temperature, then that means that there's basically not much going on anymore, and that's normally a sign that your compost is ready. And it's good to use the compost fairly soon after it's done, because you want to be keeping all of those beneficial microorganisms that are alive. You want to keep them alive and get them in your soil. Tips on using manure. Manure can be really, I don't know if you want to add to this, Emily, but just to say, manure can be really great in the garden. It's also high in nitrogen, so it can be something that you'd be using for compost. Just one caveat is to just say, just be careful if you're using horse manure. If you want to be using organic horse manure and making sure that you know where it's coming from. And because quite a lot of horse manure can contain weed killers that was used on the hay that was fed to the horses. And that can kind of remain active, and it's been associated with sort of quite problems with gardening, so stunted plant growth, etc. It's, as far as they know, not necessarily damaging to you if you eat it afterwards, but it does affect your plants. So that's just something to watch out for. And if you're not sure, maybe just talk to the person who's supplying you with manure and just ask them what they're using on any feed that's going to those animals.
I would just add a couple things to the manure. So usually I work mine into the garden in the autumn and let it sort of rot a little bit more, because sometimes when you get it, it's not quite there yet. And it also, so some people differ. Some people just put the manure back onto the plants, but I really work mine down so that the roots of the plants go down to get the nutrients. So I kind of put like manure down and then soil on top, or soil mixed with compost, and then the plants. So there's like a nice sort of path to more nutrients for them as well. And if you're planting the really hungry varieties like squash or melons that are very, very hungry plants because they make giant fruit, you really want to put manure in when you're planting them, as well as in the autumn. So make sure the ground all around them is nice and nutritious. And when you're planting your seedlings, put a big, sort of pile of some sort of nutrients. But you can also use fresh cut greens. I use leek tops with my squash before, just kind of anything that it can go to and start to break down quite quickly. In my experience works, but there may be other advice out there on that. Yeah, so yeah, besides that though, do be careful where your manure is coming from for lots of reasons. The other major reason is that you might otherwise have a lot of straw and things growing in your garden if you're not careful. So just make sure you know what you're getting.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple of questions. I don't want to run over, but I'll just see if we can take them quickly. And if anyone does need to leave on the dot at 7, then yeah, feel free to go. So what plants favour used tea leaves, and can you use compost as potting soil, or do you really need to mix it with lighter soil? Emily, is there anything you want to add to those?
I just use compost as potting soil, but you can actually shake it in a, can with holes in the back and kind of sieve it a little bit if you want to break it up. I tend to not use a lot of the potting soils because sometimes they do add like perlite to a potting soil to keep it nice and light, and I don't necessarily need that. I found compost or even, well-rotted manure mixed with my regular soil and just kind of sprinkled works quite well for my needs. I don't know anything about the tea leaves. I was just wondering if they're also acidic because I was just thinking about that. I have no idea.
I don't know. I think that probably also, quite high in nitrogen, like most sort of food waste. So that's something to be aware of. But
I've heard of people putting tea leaves on hydrangeas.
Hydrangeas, so
to change the colour. So I don't know. People empty their teapots onto hydrangea plant onto the ground
to turn them blue.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it would add acidic properties just like the coffee. I use the coffee on my hydrangeas too because I like them to be very blue.
Great. Okay, thank you. And Emily, I hope your potatoes in tires don't taste rubbery, from Sarah. Yeah.
Last year I gave them too much nitrogen, so you could barely taste them. They were so small.
Oh dear, that's brilliant. Okay, I want to wrap up on time. There's I'm going to send out the slides. There's a bunch of extra resources that we just wouldn't have had time to cover here, but do have a look through after the session, and I'll send you a recording, so I know some of you missed the beginning. I'm going to pop a feedback form in the chat. If anyone has just a few minutes to give us a little bit of feedback, I'd really, really appreciate it. This is the first session we've run on this topic, and we'd love to know what you think. So if you've got a minute, please do that. And yeah, thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Take care and have a lovely evening.
And a quick thank you for me. Thanks, Denise, and thanks, Emily. That was brilliant, really informative. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle, for helping us organise. All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye
so
now.
much.
Bye.